All right, today we're going on an adventure to learn about a brief overview of the Cuban Revolution and the subsequent theater and dance movement that occurred underneath the rule of Castro. So, here we go. Cuba is located approximately 100 miles off the southernmost coast of Florida, and it was the first and last Spanish colony. It was founded as a sugar plantation in 1495, and as a result of that, it had a large former slave and mulatto population. Cuba was the last Latin American nation to declare independence from its mother country, and that was due to the fact that the planter elite realized that without the guidance of Spain, the majority of the population would not be able to sustain a government by themselves. So, after about 80 years of independence wars, which began about 1820s, Cuba finally gained its independence from Spain in 1898, only slightly prior to the 20th century. Now, during the late 19th century, at the very end, America started extending itself beyond its continental borders, creating colonies out of island nations. And that's what happened with Cuba, the Philippines, and the other islands that were formerly owned by the Spanish Empire. Filipino commander Emilio Aguinaldo published a critique of the American actions in the Philippines in particular, called Case Against the United States, 1899. And in this, he stated that the United States initially seemed like an ally, helping these island nations fight for their independence against Spain, but the real goal was to free these nations only to use them for imperial economic gain. Back to Cuba. The United States aided Cuba during its independence wars like it did with the Philippines, but upon gaining independence from Spain, temporary control of Cuba was given to the United States through the Treaty of Paris. And, the other islands, Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, they became colonies, but Cuba was allowed to become an independent nation because provisions in the earlier Teller Amendment, which said that during the Spanish-American War, the U.S. military was allowed to occupy Cuba, but it wasn't allowed to annex Cuba into the U.S. But the Platt Amendment, which came around early 1900s, made the United States a protectorate of Cuba, meaning that Cuba at this point was pretty much a colony. And it stated that the U.S. government was allowed to militarily intervene when necessary to ensure that the newly independent Cuba was running smoothly, but Cuba had to be run by its own people. So U.S. couldn't actually run Cuba, but they just were overseers. The U.S. occupation facilitated elections in order to help Cuba start a stable democracy, and the Americans occupied Cuba until about the 1920s, and the Platt Amendment was not effective after 1934. And as far as elections go, Cuba's democracy was really fragile until 1952. Like, they had elected leaders, but it was still in the early stages and it was really shaky. And in 52, the government was overthrown by former President Fulgencio Batista. And Batista was president. He was elected president back in 1940, served a 4-year term until 1944. And after his first term, he decided to go live in the United States for a few years. Then he came back to Cuba and ran again in 52. By this point, he had lost most of his political prominence. The polls were not in his favor at this point, so instead of losing the election, Batista decided that it would be a good idea to stage a successful coup and seized governmental power for himself, ruling as a right-wing dictator. Okay. The capital city of Havana was one of the few developed cities in Cuba, and most of the students at the University of Havana were law students, such as Fidel Castro. Castro participated in popular student protests that were against Batista's regime, and the student movement really wanted to see a left-wing democracy in Cuba as opposed to the right-wing dictatorship that was currently in place. While he was a student at the university, Castro started to gain followers through propaganda. The underground newspaper El Acusador, in English, The Accuser. He quickly was gathering support and weapons and was planning to overthrow the government. And on July 26th, 1953, revolutionaries led by Fidel Castro planned to attack and seize control of the Cuban Army's Moncada barracks. The initial attack failed. Most of the revolutionaries were put in jail, exiled, but even though that part failed, this was considered the event that sparked the Cuban Revolution. Castro, whenever he was in jail, spent his time reorganizing his plan, continuing to spread his ideas to other prisoners, and he changed his movement. He changed the name of his movement to the 26th of July movement after the date when everything had started. And Castro and his brother Raul were exiled once they were out of prison. And in 1955, they met up with Che Guevara, another revolutionary, in Mexico. And they did some further reorganizing there. And for about the next 4 years, Castro and his guerrilla army swept across Cuba because they were in Mexico. They meet up with Che Guevara, they reorganize the plan, go back to Cuba, and then the army just starts sweeping across, attacking military posts, gaining support as they go along, etc. Castro, at this point, was a sensation. He and Guevara both had this aura of mystery, and they were popular cult figures. He was charismatic. He was relatable not only to the left-wing Cubans, but also to the American youth, left-wing media, and Castro's regime and his rise to power was all based upon this image that he created, his personality. And that's what he used to campaign himself and gain support for his revolutionary cause to take over Batista's government. Okay, and on New Year's Day, 1959, Batista eventually fled Cuba, left the country, leaving way for Castro to take over, and Castro's reign lasts all the way until 2008, so 1959 to 2008. Castro originally denied that he was a communist, but his main goal was to improve the social welfare of Cuba. So he pumped money into institutions that would improve the Cuban way of life, farming, education, infrastructure, healthcare, and the arts, which that is the focus of the next part of my presentation. The latter is interesting because it carries on Castro's theme of concealing reality and the truth and hiding behind a gilded image of Cuba. For example, when Castro was gathering support in the 1950s, he denied his communist agenda in order to get people, especially the neighboring Americans who were going through the Red Scare and McCarthyism. He got people to like him, and as I mentioned earlier, Castro is all about propaganda, creating this positive image of a less than positive situation, and that will be a continued theme and a continued trend throughout his regime. Same holds true for the art movement. With this new liberal leader, artists were excited for a leader that would promote their profession, and they were hopeful that the arts would become part of the Cuban national identity, which was something that was a main goal of a lot of Latin American revolutions, was that unity, that national identity that so many countries didn't have. And for some, the arts was able to provide this sense of belonging and identity. For example, because it gained Castro's support and money, the Cuban National Ballet became one of the world's leading dance schools, which initially, that seems like a pretty big deal, a really remarkable success story, considering Cuba's, the revolution had just happened, and then now the dance school's rising out of this. But upon further investigation, I proved that while Castro did fund a lot of performing arts programs in Cuba, he did this on his term. So any performers, playwrights, etc., that spoke out against his regime were silenced or exiled. And art is supposed to be an outlet for freedom of expression, but as a result of Castro's dictatorship, only those who agreed with the government and the revolution were allowed to be publicized. So out of this, your big success was the Cuban National Ballet rising to the world's world's forefront, but one of the biggest failures was censorship that drove lots of playwrights out of Cuba because they had to leave in order to be publicized. And while the performing arts did flourish under Castro, like I said, the content of performances had to be censored for objectionable content. And this was especially prevalent in theater more so than dance. Example, I found a book by Yael Present, Cuba Inside Out, Revolution in Contemporary Theater, which talks about how in 1968, the highest honor for Cuban drama, which was the Jose Antonio Ramos Award, was presented to this guy named Anton Arafat for his play called Seven Against Thebes. And the Cuban National Union of Writers and Artists, they published his play since it won the award, but they couldn't publish it until they had heavily censored it so much that it finally met the requirements to be published under Castro's regime, because it contained counter-revolutionary themes. And as soon as that label was put on Arafat's writing, his reputation in Cuba as a playwright was completely tarnished, because most of the people that were still remaining in Cuba supported Castro. Those who hadn't ended up fleeing, usually to Miami, which is Little Havana at this point. So yeah, his reputation in Cuba as a writer was tarnished, because Castro, in his speech to intellectuals, which he gave on June 30th, 1961, he talked about regarding the rights of the artists and the writers. He, quote, said that within the revolution, everything goes, and against the revolution, nothing. He made it blatantly clear at this point that he wasn't going to tolerate artwork that went against his ideas. And as a result of that, even though Seven Against Thebes won the Jose Antonio Ramos Award back in '68, it wasn't allowed to be performed in Cuba until 2007. Due to this censorship, a lot of playwrights that were born in Cuba didn't stay there due to fears of blacklisting, imprisonment, or exile. And in order to express themselves fully and their counter-revolutionary ideas, writers such as Reinaldo Arenas, Rene Ariza, Virgilio Piñera, and Ana Maria Simo, they had to leave Cuba. They opted for living in usually the most popular destinations for escaped writers were the United States, mainly Florida, and Paris, France. And in these places, they had true freedom of expression, and they could talk about Cuban issues and Cuban problems that Castro didn't allow them to. An example, like Arenas and Ariza were both jailed in Cuba for the counter-revolutionary content of their plays. And Piñera and Simo were both openly gay, and they were part of the LGBT rights movement, and homosexuals were often persecuted in Cuba. So naturally, in order for them to express art that related to issues that they cared about, they had to leave. And as a result of all of this exile and imprisonment, there's a shortage of theater written about Cuban issues by actual Cuban-only playwrights as opposed to Cuban-American or Cuban-French. Because anybody who disagreed with Castro either fled the country or they were imprisoned for their ideas. So while Castro did technically support theater with some money and funding, he did so only under his terms, only if it advocated what the government was saying and agreed with the government. So for the most part, the material brought forth by the playwrights was too controversial for Castro's Cuba. And so in a way, the theater movement failed in that it suppressed writers and forced them to go elsewhere and not benefit Cuba. And of theater and dance, dance was definitely the more successful of the two because Castro's funding brought the Cuban National Ballet from a small school which was artistically rich, but it was really tiny and didn't have the funding that it needed. But it was founded by Alicia Alonso in 1948, and it was originally self-titled the Alicia Alonso Ballet Company, and it lacked funds to become a major school. But Alonso and her husband supported Castro and the revolution. So as a result of that, Castro awarded Alonso $200,000 to put into the Cuban National Ballet. And the Cuban National Ballet, which became one of the leading schools in the entire world, was modeled like many of Castro's other ideas for communist Cuba, was modeled after ballet schools in the Soviet Union. So Alonso's goal for making the ballet school such a big deal was to train professional dancers and to create jobs for people working in the technical fields, such as lighting, sound, and costuming. And subsequently, this also, according to it's a 1997 documentary called Cuba, The Children of Fidel. It's part of the Women in Latin America series. It interviewed both the women who stayed in Cuba and supported Castro, and then it also did interviews with women who had fled Cuba and moved to Miami, Florida. And it provided firsthand accounts of how the arts, particularly ballet from Alonso's ballet school, it empowered women throughout the revolution and through Castro's reign. And many women joined the workforce during the revolution, much like American women did during World War II. They made wartime necessities, and then after the revolution, they continued to still keep these factory jobs. But the ballet, a major success as far as human rights go, is the ballet was not only worldwidely successful, but it provided empowerment for women in Cuba who maybe didn't want a factory job and wanted a job in the arts. It gave them that opportunity that they'd never had before. So naturally, what I've gathered is that it's a fair assumption to say that Cuban ballet was more influential on the Cuban identity that Castro was trying to create than Cuban theater was. And it was just because of the nature of its performances. Playwrights and theater in general, theater is meant to be controversial. And these playwrights, most playwrights from Cuba were counter-revolutionary. But Alicia Alonso and the Cuban National Ballet performed pieces that catered to Castro. They performed shows such as Despertar, which in English is The Awakening, and it depicted the struggles of the revolutionaries. So because Castro supported the types of shows that the ballet was producing, he was more willing to fund them. As a result, Castro invested lots of money in developing the ballet specifically. As a side note, I did find it rather ironic that Cuba modeled the ballet after the Soviet Union, and Castro modeled most of Cuba after the Soviet Union. And I just found it odd that the communists were so into ballet, which is the dance that's known for its elitism and its aristocracy, and I just found that interesting. So to sum this up, Cuba gained its independence, 1898, but it never really became independent because of the United States occupation that resulted from independence. Democracy was young and fragile, and therefore it was easily taken over by Batista in 1952. 23rd of July, 1953, the Cuban Revolution was first sparked. Castro attempted to seize the Moncada barracks. That attempt failed, but that was the event that really set the Cuban Revolution into motion. Castro modeled himself after the man whose writings instigated the independence movement, which was José Martí, and he based his entire regime and his support gathering based upon this cult following and his personality that he had created. Castro's army ran Batista out of the country, and Castro was in power from 1959 to 2008. He was a left-wing communist. He advocated the improvement of social welfare, and he invested in institutions such as the performing arts. The subsequent theater and dance revolution was successful because it launched the Cuban National Ballet onto the world stage, and it helped to create this Cuban identity. But a huge failure of the theater and dance, particularly with theater, was that it didn't allow everyone to creatively express themselves, because only the ones who agreed with Castro were allowed to be publicized. Counter-revolutionaries were jailed, exiled, or they willingly fled from Cuba. Mostly the recurring theme throughout Castro's entire regime, whether it has to do with just his running of Cuba or performing arts in particular, was the whole regime was based upon creating a positive image that didn't always reflect truth and reality of what was going on in Cuba. And that appears to conclude this presentation about Cuba, its revolution, and subsequent theater and performing arts. If you want any more information on this, check out these slides that have been attached here. And it's got books, primary sources, etc. And thank you for tuning in.